Ladies and gentlemen, while the television series Peaky Blinders has catapulted the name into global pop culture, many people are surprised to learn that the Peaky Blinders were not simply fictional creations. They were, in fact, a very real gang that roamed the streets of Birmingham, England. Their origins can be traced back to the late 19th century, specifically around the early 1890s, in an era when the city was grappling with deep economic disparity, industrial overpopulation, and a rapid rise in urban crime. The real Peaky Blinders were one of several gangs that operated in Birmingham during this period, alongside others like the Sloggers and the Birmingham Boys. They didn't emerge from the ashes of World War I as the show suggests. Instead, they formed decades earlier, in a gritty environment where survival often depended on violence, loyalty, and street smarts. These gangs were a direct product of their time, born out of poverty, lack of education, and a society that offered little to no upward mobility for the working class. What made the Peaky Blinders distinct in their early years wasn't their criminal empire, because they didn't have one in the sense that the show depicts, but their style and street presence. They became known for their flamboyant clothing, which included tailored jackets, silk scarves, bell-bottom trousers, and their signature peaked flat caps, from which the nickname Peaky likely derives. In a world dominated by soot, grime, and factory labor, the Peaky Blinders stood out with their deliberate attempts at swagger and street fashion. Some reports even suggest that part of their intimidation tactic was to appear better dressed than their victims, reinforcing a sense of superiority and dominance. The gang's activity mainly involved street-level crimes, robbery, pickpocketing, assault, illegal gambling, and occasional gang fights. They often clashed with rival groups for territorial control over neighborhoods and betting operations. Over time, the name Peaky Blinders became less about a specific, tightly organized group and more of a label used by the press and the public to describe violent young men who dressed in a certain way and terrorized certain parts of the city. Their reign, though brutal on a local scale, was relatively short-lived. By the 1910s, much of their influence had declined as larger and more structured criminal organizations began to dominate Birmingham's underworld. But the myth of the Peaky Blinders lingered in local lore, stories of dapper street thugs with a taste for violence. And it was these tales, passed down through generations, that eventually inspired the hit television series. Despite the fearsome reputation and the dangerous aura attached to the name Peaky Blinders today, thanks largely to the TV show, the actual criminal activities of the real-life gang were far less glamorous and far more local in scale. The real Peaky Blinders were not drug lords or arms dealers orchestrating elaborate criminal empires. Instead, their crimes were primarily petty, opportunistic, and often fueled by immediate survival needs. At their core, they were street-level criminals, operating in some of Birmingham's poorest and most overcrowded districts. Their day-to-day criminal activities included pickpocketing, street mugging, shoplifting, and extortion of local businesses and market vendors. These were crimes of desperation and control, not grand heists or political maneuvers. They would often target drunken passers-by or local vendors who refused to pay for protection, asserting their presence through intimidation and violence. One of their major sources of income was illegal betting and gambling rackets. In working-class neighborhoods, gambling was both a popular pastime and a lucrative underground industry. The Peaky Blinders inserted themselves into this world not as sophisticated bookmakers, but more often as enforcers or street-level organizers of illegal games. They would take cuts from bets, fix outcomes, or use violence to control who could or couldn't participate in local gambling scenes. Assault and street fighting were also central to their identity, not just for dominance, but as a public display of power. Members were known to roam the streets in groups, picking fights with rivals or civilians to instill fear and assert their territory. Knife fights, beatings, and pub brawls were common. This constant violence gave them notoriety, but also limited their ability to rise into more structured or secretive forms of organized crime. They thrived more on chaotic street violence than on strategic criminal planning. Another dimension of their criminality was their relationship with the police. Corruption and intimidation often went hand in hand. While some officers may have turned a blind eye to their activities, others found themselves as targets of assault when they tried to enforce the law. However, Unlike the show's depiction of the gang infiltrating high levels of government or using inside men in the police force, the real Peaky Blinders had little political influence. Their presence was mostly felt in the slums and alleyways, not in courtrooms or parliament buildings. What's clear is that the real Peaky Blinders were street thugs, not masterminds. Their legacy wasn't built on complex criminal networks, but on the raw, day-to-day violence of slum life. Their crimes were largely reactionary, rooted in poverty, class tension, and the need to survive in a harsh, unforgiving urban landscape. One of the most iconic and chilling images associated with the Peaky Blinders, thanks to the TV show, is that of gang members sewing razor blades into the peaks of their flat caps, turning a stylish accessory into a concealed weapon. This idea is both terrifying and cinematic, perfectly fitting the gritty, violent tone of the series. However, when we look into the actual historical record, there is no strong or verifiable evidence that the real-life Peaky Blinders ever used razor blades in this way. In fact, the notion likely leans more towards myth than documented truth. The first issue lies in technological and economic practicality. Razor blades, especially thin disposable ones that could be easily hidden or sewn into fabric, weren't commonly available in Britain until around 1903, following the invention and popularization of the Gillette safety razor. The original Peaky Blinders had already been active for nearly a decade by that point, and most of their influence had started to decline by the time such blades became widely accessible. Prior to that, razors were bulky and straight-edged, more like barber tools than hidden weapons, making it unlikely they could be stealthily embedded in the soft fabric of a cap. Even beyond availability, the practicality of using a hat as a weapon in the heat of a brawl is questionable. Imagine swinging your head or removing your hat mid-fight to swipe at someone's face. It's far less effective than simply using your fists, knives, or clubs, which were common weapons at the time. Historical police reports, newspaper articles, and eyewitness accounts of gang violence from the 1890s and early 1900s make frequent mention of brass knuckles, belts with buckles, knives, and other street weapons, but rarely, if ever, mention hats being used as weapons, let alone containing hidden blades. So where did this powerful image come from? Most historians agree that the razor blade cap legend likely evolved later, perhaps as an exaggeration of the gang's violent reputation, or as a creative flourish added by storytellers and writers. It's a compelling symbol, a gang so stylish yet deadly that even their clothing is weaponized. It fits perfectly into a television narrative, where every item of costume design doubles as a statement about character and danger. Stephen Knight, the show's creator, has acknowledged that many elements of the story, including the razor blade caps, are theatrical enhancements rather than facts drawn from the historical record. Yet over time, thanks to the power of popular media, this fictional detail has been absorbed into the popular mythology of the Peaky Blinders, blurring the line between reality and creative fiction. Even without the blades, however, the flat cap itself was still a defining feature of the gang's identity. Members took pride in their appearance, often dressing sharply to stand out in a bleak industrial environment. Their style was a deliberate contrast to their surroundings, a kind of street-level swagger that signaled fearlessness and control. But the caps were more of a fashion statement than a tactical weapon. One of the biggest differences between the real Peaky Blinders and their television counterparts lies in who they actually were. In the show, the gang is portrayed as a tightly knit organization led by seasoned, battle-hardened men, many of whom are former World War I soldiers with psychological scars, military strategy, and a cold-blooded sense of leadership. But the truth is strikingly different. The real Peaky Blinders were not war veterans or sophisticated criminal tacticians. They were, more often than not, teenagers and very young men, some reportedly as young as 12 or 13 years old. Historical police records and court documents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries describe the members of the Peaky Blinders as juvenile delinquents, frequently arrested for crimes such as pickpocketing, vandalism, assault, and theft. These boys came from working-class families, many of whom lived in extreme poverty in Birmingham's slums. With little access to education, opportunity, or social support, joining a gang offered them a kind of belonging, identity, and survival mechanism in a city that offered them very little else. The myth of the Peaky Blinders as post-war masterminds, like the character of Thomas Shelby, is rooted in fictional storytelling, not historical accuracy. In reality, the real gang had already started to fade away before World War I even began. Most of their documented activity was concentrated in the 1890s to early 1910s, and by the time the Great War broke out in 1914, much of the original gang had been absorbed into other emerging criminal groups or broken up by law enforcement crackdowns. The youthful nature of the real gang also influenced their behavior. These were not men running black market deals across national borders or laundering money through shell companies. Instead, they engaged in more impulsive, brash acts of street crime and public violence, often more concerned with local reputation than long-term gain. Their actions were often spontaneous, driven by emotion, peer pressure, or the need to prove toughness, rather than strategic planning. This distinction is crucial because it changes how we view the gang's role in history. On television, the Peaky Blinders are painted as visionary antiheroes, flawed, but brilliant, who rise through the ranks of Britain's underworld. The real-life gang, however, represents something much more tragic, a generation of lost youth, consumed by poverty and pulled into a cycle of violence at an early age. Their criminality wasn't glamorous or heroic. It was often reckless, short-sighted, and destructive. Despite their age, these young men didn't instill fear. Their unpredictability, willingness to fight, and growing numbers made them a serious problem for local authorities. But at the end of the day, their youth also made them vulnerable to imprisonment, to violence, and to being used by older, more manipulative figures in the criminal underworld. One of the most compelling aspects of the Peaky Blinders television series is the deep sense of atmosphere and authenticity it exudes, from the gritty cobblestone streets of Birmingham to the smoldering intensity of its lead characters. But what many viewers don't realize is that the show's origin story isn't rooted in strict academic research or historical documentation, but rather in something far more personal. The childhood memories and family stories passed down to the show's creator, Stephen Knight. Knight has often spoken publicly about how the idea for Peaky Blinders came from tales told by his father, who grew up in Birmingham. These weren't polished historical lectures. They were scraps of legend, tales whispered at the dinner table about sharply dressed men who ruled the streets, carried themselves with intimidating confidence, and inspired both fear and admiration. His father described how local boys would look up to these gangsters not just because of their criminal reputation, but because of the way they dressed, walked, and took control in a society that offered little to people of working-class origins. It's important to understand that Knight was not trying to recreate a historically perfect documentary-style series. Instead, his mission was to capture the essence of those stories, the feeling of danger, rebellion, and raw ambition that permeated the streets of post-industrial Britain. In doing so, he elevated the gang from small-time street criminals into something far more operatic, a family-run empire that clashed with the government, rival gangs, and even its own moral boundaries. This artistic freedom allowed Knight to infuse the story with powerful themes: post-war trauma, political unrest, class struggle, and the rise of ambition from society's lower rungs. While these elements make for incredible drama, they are not direct reflections of historical events. The real Peaky Blinders were not engaged in long conversations about socialism, Irish politics, or fascist movements. Those plot lines are creative overlays, designed to deepen the characters and widen the historical scope of the story. Moreover, many of the key characters in the show, such as Tommy, Arthur, and Polly Gray, are fictional creations. They don't correspond to any real-life gang leaders from the actual Peaky Blinders. Rather, they represent the kind of mythological figures that form in the collective imagination when stories are passed from one generation to the next. Stephen Knight gave them names, faces, and backstories, transforming oral history into a fully fleshed-out television universe. This approach is what gives Peaky Blinders its unique tone. It's not just a period crime drama, but a blend of historical fiction and personal mythology. It's a world where the grime of industrial England meets the operatic scale of Shakespearean tragedy. By grounding his fictional characters in the emotional truth of family folklore rather than strict facts, Knight was able to create a narrative that resonates deeply with viewers, even if the historical accuracy takes a back seat. While the Peaky Blinders TV show portrays the Shelby family as enduring forces of power, surviving war, political pressure, and rival criminal empires, the real-life gang didn't enjoy such a prolonged or dominant reign. In truth, the real Peaky Blinders began to lose their grip on Birmingham's criminal underworld well before World War I, largely due to two major forces: the increasing professionalism and expansion of local policing, and the emergence of more powerful, organized gangs like the Sabinis. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain's urban centers were undergoing major changes. With rising crime, urban poverty, and social unrest, cities like Birmingham began to invest more heavily in their police forces. Law enforcement transitioned from loosely organized local patrols to a more centralized, better trained, and better equipped system of policing. Police officers were given expanded authority, new tactics for crowd control and gang suppression, and in some areas, access to improved intelligence networks that allowed them to better track and infiltrate criminal groups. The Peaky Blinders, who had previously thrived in neighborhoods where law enforcement was weak or overwhelmed, began to find themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Raids on gang-controlled pubs and betting shops became more frequent. Known members were regularly arrested and given harsher sentences. As the law closed in, some members attempted to fade into obscurity, while others were absorbed into different, newer criminal alliances. But perhaps the greatest threat to the Peaky Blinders came not from the police, but from the rise of rival gangs, particularly the Sabini gang, which would go on to dominate organized crime in parts of England throughout the early 20th century. Led by Charles Darby Sabini, this gang was far more strategically minded and financially driven than the chaotic and territorial Peaky Blinders. The Sabinis were involved in high-stakes racecourse rackets, blackmail, and protection schemes, expanding their influence into London and beyond. What set the Sabinis apart was their ability to build a criminal network with deep ties to corrupt officials, bookmakers, and even sections of law enforcement. They operated like a business, not a street gang. In contrast, the Peaky Blinders had built their reputation on street-level violence, intimidation, and flashy style, but they lacked the organizational structure and forward planning necessary to survive in a changing underworld. As the Sabinis and other powerful crime families gained ground, they either pushed out or absorbed smaller gangs like the Peaky Blinders. Some former members attempted to join these larger syndicates, while others were eliminated or simply faded away as law enforcement pressure increased. This shift marked a turning point in British gang history, from loosely organized street crews to larger, more sophisticated criminal enterprises, many of which operated behind the scenes and wielded influence far beyond the neighborhoods they originally came from. It's also worth noting that the cultural landscape of Britain was evolving. With the end of the Victorian era, the rise of labor movements, and changes in how urban poverty was addressed, the world that allowed the Peaky Blinders to flourish began to disappear. Slums were being redeveloped, education reforms were slowly being introduced, and young people were being offered alternatives, however limited, to lives of street crime. The romanticized reign of gang rule was being slowly replaced by a more modern, law-governed society. Though the real Peaky Blinders were relatively short-lived and far less powerful than their fictional counterparts, their legend has only grown stronger over time, largely due to how popular media, fashion trends, and public fascination with antiheroes have reimagined their story. What began as a local gang in the streets of industrial Birmingham has evolved into a global cultural phenomenon, recognized around the world not just for crime, but for style, rebellion, and identity. Much of this transformation began with the Peaky Blinders TV series, which didn't just resurrect a historical gang, but redefined them. On screen, they were portrayed as brooding, sharply dressed, emotionally complex figures who operated with a strange code of honor. Viewers were drawn to their charisma, their loyalty to family, and their refusal to be crushed by society's elite. Suddenly, the name Peaky Blinders wasn't associated with petty theft or teenage street fights. It was synonymous with coolness, sophistication, and defiance. This new image bled beyond the screen and into mainstream fashion and lifestyle culture. The flat caps, tailored three-piece suits, long overcoats, pocket watches, and even undercut hairstyles worn by the show's characters quickly became fashion statements, influencing designer collections, barbershop trends, and wedding themes. For many, dressing like a Peaky Blinder became a way of channeling a vintage, rugged masculinity wrapped in elegance and danger. But fashion was only one part of the phenomenon. The characters themselves, especially Thomas Shelby, became modern myths. He's not just a gangster. He's a war hero, a businessman, a politician, and a deeply conflicted human being. This blending of identities speaks to something powerful in the human psyche. The idea of rising from nothing, seizing control of your fate, and refusing to be confined by class or trauma. Even though the real Peaky Blinders never achieved such mythic heights, the fictional versions serve as symbols of ambition and survival, no matter how morally ambiguous they might be. There's also a broader cultural shift at play here. In the 21st century, audiences have shown increasing interest in flawed protagonists and morally gray characters. We've seen it with figures like Tony Montana, Walter White, and now Thomas Shelby. These are not clean-cut heroes, but complex people shaped by pain, ambition, and circumstance. The Peaky Blinders myth fits perfectly into this narrative trend, allowing viewers to root for characters who do terrible things, because they also carry deep wounds, personal codes, and a fierce sense of justice in a corrupt world. This romanticized image of gang life contrasts sharply with the harsh realities faced by the original Peaky Blinders. The real gang members lived in poverty, faced brutal conditions, and were involved in crimes that brought suffering, not swagger. Yet, as time has passed, the raw, difficult truth has been softened, wrapped in drama and stylized storytelling, and repackaged into something more glamorous and digestible for a modern audience. Perhaps this is the ultimate irony. A group of troubled youths who once roamed the back alleys of Birmingham, feared by local shopkeepers and chased by police, have now become cultural icons, immortalized not because of what they truly were, but because of what we wanted them to be. Their legend has been reshaped by nostalgia, style, and the timeless allure of rebellion, and in doing so, they've transcended history and entered the realm of folklore. So, while Peaky Blinders has undoubtedly captured the world's imagination with its gripping storytelling, unforgettable characters, and stylish cinematography, it's important to remember that behind the fiction lies a much grittier truth. The real Peaky Blinders were not masterminds of organized crime, but a product of their time, young, impoverished, and caught in a web of violence and survival.